In the late 1930s, the United States watched wars abroad reshape ideas about how small, mobile forces could be used. German airborne and motorized units in Europe, Japanese advances in China, and British experiments with commandos all suggested that limited numbers of specially trained troops could strike ports, airfields, and supply nodes without committing entire divisions. American observers in London and Chongqing reported on raids across the English Channel and on Chinese guerrilla operations behind Japanese lines, and their reports reached the Navy and Marine Corps planning staffs. Within the U.S. Sea Services, the Marine Corps already saw itself as an expeditionary force for seizing and defending advanced bases. War plans such as Orange, which envisioned conflict with Japan in the Pacific, assumed that Marines would capture island airfields and harbors to support the fleet. On paper, this mission required assault troops trained for amphibious landings. In practice, most Marine units were organized as conventional infantry regiments, supported by artillery and heavy weapons, without dedicated formations for long-range raids or independent coastal operations. The outbreak of war in Europe in 1939 and the fall of France in June 1940 accelerated American interest in special-purpose forces. Britain's use of commandos for raids on Lofoten, Vaag-Zo, and other coastal targets showed that small forces delivered by sea could damage enemy infrastructure, force the diversion of garrisons, and gather intelligence out of proportion to their numbers. U.S. naval observers noted that these units trained intensively in amphibious craft handling, demolition, and night navigation, areas that overlapped with existing Marine skills but pushed them into more specialized directions. At the same time, individual Marine officers were drawing lessons from Asia. Major Evans F. Carlson, who had served as an observer with Chinese Communist forces in the late 1930s, studied how relatively lightly equipped units carried out deep penetrations, depended on local supply, and relied on strong internal cohesion to maintain discipline over long marches. His reports, which discussed political indoctrination and flexible small unit tactics, circulated in limited form inside the Corps and influenced his own ideas about future American raiding units. The geopolitical balance in the Pacific further heightened interest in such capabilities. Japan, with roughly 1.7 million men under arms by 1941, held bases from Korea through Formosa to the mandated islands of the Central Pacific, defended by garrisons, coastal guns, and airfields. The United States, with an active-duty Marine Corps of about 65,000 personnel in mid-1941, maintained outposts in Hawaii, the Philippines, and a chain of Pacific islands, but lacked forces dedicated to sudden shore raids against these positions. American planners expected that any war would involve a step-by-step advance across island groups, and saw potential value in units that could probe defenses, destroy key installations, or support local resistance before main landings. Inside Washington, the discussion over special units crossed service boundaries. The Army, encouraged by British examples, began forming Ranger battalions in 1942. The Navy considered underwater demolition and small boat units. Advocates of Marine raiding forces argued that the Corps could provide a parallel capability tailored to the island war that seemed increasingly likely in the Pacific. Skeptics within the Corps, however, worried that hand-picked formations might drain experienced non-commissioned officers from line battalions and create perceptions of an elite within an already selective service. Public opinion in the United States, shaped by newspaper coverage of British commando activity and by growing tension with Japan after the occupation of Indochina and the U.S. oil embargo of July 1941, was receptive to the idea of highly trained raiding forces. For political leaders, such units promised visible offensive action even if larger operations were still in preparation. For Japanese authorities, the prospect of American sea-based raids threatened isolated garrisons and lines of communication that stretched thousands of kilometers across the Pacific. In this environment of competing imperial strategies and evolving military doctrine, the conditions were set for the appearance of formations that the U.S. government would formally designate in 1942 as Marine Raiders. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and the rapid seizure of Guam, Wake Island, and key positions in the Philippines confronted U.S. leaders with a situation in which the Pacific Fleet and its marine garrisons were largely on the defensive. Within weeks, discussions in Washington and at Navy and Marine Corps headquarters turned from abstract plans for a possible Pacific War to urgent questions about how to strike back against Japanese positions dispersed across island chains. One proposal, supported by officers who had studied British practice, was to create specialized marine units capable of limited but highly focused operations against outposts, fuel depots, and communication centers. At the political level, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and senior naval planners understood that such units could serve both operational and symbolic purposes. Early raids, even if limited in scale, could demonstrate that the United States was able to reach into the expanding Japanese perimeter. Naval leadership under Admiral Ernest J. King examined whether the Marine Corps, already tasked with amphibious warfare, could furnish formations designed for rapid embarkation on cruisers, destroyer transports, and submarines. Marine Commandant Major General Thomas Holcomb accepted the concept in principle, but insisted that any new units remain under Marine Corps organizational control, rather than becoming independent naval commands. The first concrete step occurred in early 1942, when orders were issued to organize a raider battalion for service with the Pacific Fleet. At Quantico, Virginia, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion was activated on the 16th of February 1942 under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Edson. Its authorized strength was roughly 900 officers and enlisted men, structured into a headquarters company and 4 rifle companies, each divided into platoons and squads optimized for high firepower and mobility. Training schedules emphasized amphibious landings from small boats, cliff scaling, demolitions, night firing, and rapid movement across rugged terrain, differentiating the unit's preparation from that of standard Marine infantry regiments. On the opposite coast, at Camp Elliott near San Diego, a 2nd Raider Battalion took shape under Lieutenant Colonel Evans F. Carlson. Drawing on his observations of Chinese forces, Carlson experimented with an internal structure that placed more authority at the level of small groups and introduced the 10-man fire team as a basic tactical element. Instruction included extended field exercises, coordinated movement by dispersed squads, and rehearsals for operating at some distance from supply echelons. While Edson's battalion retained a configuration closer to conventional Marine practice, Carlson's organization represented an attempt to adapt foreign experiences to U.S. conditions. The process of forming these units generated debate within the Marine Corps. To staff the Raider battalions with experienced personnel, recruiters sought volunteers from existing regiments who met high standards of physical fitness, marksmanship, and previous field or sea service. This selection removed seasoned non-commissioned officers and specialists from line organizations that were themselves preparing for combat. Some regimental commanders argued that concentrating such personnel in raiding formations weakened the broader corps at a time when entire divisions would be needed for large amphibious assaults. Supporters countered that the scale of planned operations required a spectrum of capabilities, including small forces for reconnaissance and demolition missions. Command relationships and operational control were also subjects of negotiation. The Navy wanted Raider battalions available for quick assignment to task forces under fleet commanders, while Marine leadership favored integration within the Fleet Marine Force to preserve doctrinal coherence. The arrangement eventually adopted placed Raider units administratively within the Marine Corps, but made them available for attachment to naval task organizations, allowing them to operate from fast transports, auxiliary aircraft carriers, and submarines according to mission requirements. This hybrid status marked them as neither purely experimental detachments nor standard infantry formations. Outside the United States, awareness of these developments grew gradually. British officers who had experience with commando training visited Marine installations and exchanged methods for boat handling, demolitions, and combined operations, while advisors from the U.S. side examined how far European models could be applied in Pacific environments where distances between targets were far greater. Japanese intelligence, monitoring U.S. troop movements through signals and observation, registered the formation of new Marine units, but initially lacked detailed information about their intended role, viewing them alongside the Army's Rangers as part of a broader American trend toward specialized light infantry. By mid-1942, with the 1st and 2nd Raider battalions formed and initial cadres for the 3rd and 4th Raiders being assembled in Samoa and California, the concept had moved from paper to operational readiness. These battalions, each numbering several hundred personnel trained for night landings, rapid inland movement, and demolition tasks, were earmarked for upcoming operations in the South and Central Pacific. The opening phase of the Marine Raider story thus consisted not of battles, but of organizational experiments, competing doctrines, and the alignment of political expectations with the practical limits of small, sea-mobile forces. As 1942 progressed, American strategic planning in the Pacific moved from improvisation toward a more structured campaign. At the highest level, the U.S. adopted a Germany first policy, but within the Pacific theater, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz sought ways to halt Japanese consolidation and to create forward positions for future operations. The Marine Raider battalions were inserted into this framework as tools for seizing minor objectives, testing enemy defenses, and gathering intelligence ahead of larger landings. Their limited manpower, with battalions averaging under 1,000 personnel, meant that they could not decide campaigns alone, but planners regarded them as suitable for discrete, high-risk tasks. In the South Pacific, the decision to initiate Operation Watchtower, the landings on Guadalcanal, and nearby islands scheduled for August 1942, gave the Raiders a defined role. The 1st Marine Raider Battalion under Edson was designated to land on Tulagi and adjacent islets, whose combined garrisons and installations were estimated at several hundred Japanese naval personnel, including construction units and seaplane detachments. For this mission, planners expected the Raiders to secure the islands quickly, neutralize coastal defenses, and prevent interference with the main landing on Guadalcanal, where the 1st Marine Division would attempt to capture an airfield under construction. In parallel, the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion under Carlson received a different assignment. Pacific Fleet staff considered how submarine-borne forces might strike isolated atolls used as way stations or seaplane bases. The Makin Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, held by a Japanese garrison numbering fewer than 100 men, became the target for a raid intended to destroy facilities, sink small craft, and force Tokyo to divert resources to rear-area defense. For this operation, Carlson's battalion was to be split into companies embarked on 2 submarines, emphasizing stealth and surprise over sustained occupation. The contrast between Tulagi as an integral part of a broader amphibious offensive and Makin as a standalone raid illustrates how planners envisioned multiple roles for the Raiders. Logistical considerations shaped these plans. Amphibious doctrine, refined in pre-war exercises, assumed that assault troops would land from transports and destroyer transports using landing craft, such as Higgins boats. For the Raiders, additional training focused on rapid embarkation and debarkation, hand-carried demolition charges, and light weapons that could be moved easily over coral, jungle, or steep ground. Heavy artillery and vehicles were largely absent from their tables of organization, reducing their immediate firepower, but easing the burden on shipping and landing craft capacity within task forces that also had to carry infantry regiments, supply units, and aviation elements. On the Japanese side, strategic goals centered on holding a defensive perimeter stretching through the Marshalls, Gilberts, Solomons, and New Guinea. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army allocated garrisons to key islands, but the distribution reflected competing priorities and limited transport tonnage. Main bases such as Rabaul received large contingents and air units, while outlying positions like Makin or Tulagi initially held modest forces, often composed of naval construction troops, small detachments of special naval landing forces, and support personnel. Japanese planners expected that distance, scattered American resources, and control of intermediate bases would delay any Allied move into these areas. Japanese defensive planning assumed that local garrisons could hold out long enough for reinforcements from larger bases to respond. Coastal guns, seaplane facilities, and small craft were intended to complicate Allied approach routes. However, war games and staff studies did not always account for the possibility that small, specially trained enemy forces might strike quickly at isolated positions and withdraw before relief arrived. Information about American raider units was fragmentary, and Japanese assessments tended to group all specialized enemy infantry under broad categories without distinguishing their exact capabilities. Within the Allied camp, coordination between the Navy, Marine Corps, and Army required adjustments. Task force commanders had to decide how best to employ the raiders without exposing them to missions better suited to larger formations. Operational orders for Tulagi and Makin specified clear objectives, time limits, and withdrawal plans, recognizing that extended engagements could lead to disproportionate losses for units whose strength was measured in hundreds rather than thousands. Intelligence sections compiled aerial photographs and reports from coast watchers and local inhabitants to estimate enemy numbers and positions. But uncertainties remained, particularly regarding underground shelters and concealed gun emplacements. Propaganda considerations also formed part of the planning. U.S. authorities understood that successful operations by Marine raiders, especially if announced with carefully prepared communiques, could bolster domestic morale and signal to Allied partners that the United States was moving from defense to limited offensive action in the Pacific. Japanese authorities, for their part, monitored Allied radio broadcasts and press reports to assess whether these raids indicated a broader shift in American capabilities or remained isolated actions. Thus, strategic goals for the employment of raider units combined operational tasks, seizure or destruction of specific targets, with psychological and political effects that extended beyond the small scale of the forces directly involved. The first test of the Marine Raider concept came during the initial American counteroffensive in the Solomon Islands. On 7 August 1942, as the main elements of the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion under Merritt Edson went ashore on Tulagi, supported by the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. Naval intelligence had estimated a Japanese force of a few hundred Special Naval Landing Force troops and construction personnel. In reality, roughly 350 to 400 defenders, including members of the 3rd Cure Special Naval Landing Force and support units, occupied dug-in positions and tunnels along the ridges and shorelines. The raiders, numbering around 750 men and assault elements, advanced inland from the beaches and quickly encountered resistance near a series of shallow ravines and prepared strong points. The terrain, with coral ridges, dense vegetation, and a narrow coastal strip, limited the use of supporting armor and complicated artillery observation. Japanese troops, equipped with light machine guns, grenade dischargers, and small mortars, used concealed positions to fire at close range, forcing the raiders to rely on coordinated rifle and automatic weapon fire, grenades, and limited 60mm mortar support. Fighting continued into the night, with Japanese groups attempting infiltration and close-quarters attacks. By the morning of August 8th, organized Japanese resistance on Tulagi had largely ceased, though small groups continued to resist from caves and bunkers. American reports listed several hundred Japanese dead and only a handful of prisoners, reflecting Japanese orders and doctrine that discouraged surrender. The raiders and attached Marines suffered several dozen killed and over 100 wounded. The engagement demonstrated that a battalion-sized raiding force could capture a small but fortified island, but only at the cost of sustained combat rather than a brief, purely disruptive operation. For the Japanese command, the loss of Tulagi and nearby islets signaled that lightly garrisoned outposts near major bases were vulnerable to sudden amphibious assaults. Shortly afterward, attention shifted to another type of operation, the submarine delivered raid on Makin Atoll. In mid-August 1942, approximately 220 men from the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion embarked on 2 submarines, USS Nautilus and USS Argonaut, with orders to land on Butaritari Island on the 17th of August. Their objectives were to destroy installations, capture documents, take prisoners if possible, and withdraw after 24 hours. Japanese forces on Makin were believed to consist of about 70 to 80 naval personnel, including a detachment of the 62nd Guard Unit and Air Service troops. The landing did not proceed as planned, Heavy surf and darkness disrupted the deployment of rubber boats, scattering elements along the shore and delaying the assembly of units. Once ashore, raider companies moved inland and encountered resistance from small Japanese groups equipped with light weapons. Firefights developed around the seaplane ramp and administrative buildings. A Japanese flying boat that attempted to land during the raid was engaged with small arms and machine guns, resulting in its destruction. Communications between separated raider elements and the submarines were hampered by damaged radios and misinterpreted signals, complicating coordination for withdrawal. By the end of the day, the raiders had killed most of the Japanese garrison and destroyed fuel dumps, equipment, and small craft. However, difficulties in re-embarking through the surf led to the loss of several boats, and the temporary belief that a contingent of raiders had been left behind. Commanders considered surrendering a group to avoid their capture or destruction, but a final search revealed that most personnel had managed to return to the submarines. Casualty figures for the raid included around 18 raiders killed, and a similar number missing, some presumed drowned, while Japanese losses were estimated at over 80 dead. The operation, although tactically successful in damaging facilities, exposed the limits of small units operating at great distance from support. Civilian impact during these first engagements varied. Tulagi and the surrounding small islands had only a limited resident population, mainly associated with colonial administration and commercial activity. Most non-combatants had been evacuated earlier. On Makin, local Gilbertes inhabitants witnessed the raid and its aftermath, experiencing the presence of both Japanese and American forces in rapid succession. For them, the operation signaled that the wider war in the Pacific could directly reach small atolls that previously had seen only garrison activity and occasional aircraft movements. These first engagements provided both sides with immediate lessons. For the Marine Corps and Navy, the actions at Tulagi and Makin demonstrated that raider units could achieve assigned tactical objectives, but were subject to the same constraints as other infantry: terrain, weather, surf conditions, and the accuracy of pre-war intelligence. For Japanese planners, the loss of small outposts to limited American forces contributed to later decisions to reinforce key islands more heavily, and to reconsider assumptions about the security provided by distance and scattered garrisons. The period after Tulagi and Makin saw the Marine Raider battalions drawn into broader operations that exceeded the original concept of short, sharp strikes. On Guadalcanal, where the 1st Marine Division had landed, with approximately 11,000 combat troops in August 1942, subsequent Japanese efforts to retake the airfield at Lunga transformed the island into a prolonged battleground. Reinforcements from the Japanese 17th Army, moving by destroyer convoys from bases at Rabaul and Shortland, progressively increased the scale of fighting and brought larger formations into contact with the raiders. The 1st Marine Raider Battalion, initially earmarked for specialized roles, was soon employed as part of the perimeter defense around Henderson Field. In early September 1942, U.S. intelligence and Coast Watcher reports indicated that Japanese forces under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi were advancing through the jungle with several thousand men, including elements of the 35th Infantry Brigade, Special Naval Landing Forces, and support units. The American command expected an attempt to break through the southern sector of the perimeter, where terrain consisted of ridges and ravines offering covered approaches. On September 8th, Edson's raiders and attached parachute troops conducted a raid on Tasimboko, on the island's north coast. Landing with several hundred men supported by landing craft and naval gunfire, they overran a forward Japanese supply base, capturing documents, rations, and equipment. The destruction of stores, including food and artillery ammunition, reduced the supplies available to Kawaguchi's force and provided the Americans with detailed information on Japanese strength and intentions. For the Japanese, the loss of these dumps and the realization that their rear areas were vulnerable complicated an already difficult march through dense terrain. The escalation reached a critical point during the nights of September the 12th to 14th, in what became known in U.S. records as the Battle of Edson's Ridge. Approximately 840 raiders and parachutists reinforced by elements of the 1st and later the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, held defensive positions along a series of ridges south of the airfield. Facing them were several thousand Japanese troops organized into assault echelons, supported by mortars and limited artillery. Attacks came in waves across ravines and up the slopes, often at close range and darkness, with both sides relying on small arms, automatic weapons, grenades, and flares to identify targets. The fighting produced high casualties relative to the numbers engaged. American reports recorded hundreds of Japanese dead in front of the ridge positions and along the approaches, while U.S. units suffered more than 100 killed and several hundred wounded over the course of the battles. For the Marine Raiders, the engagement underscored that their training in night operations and small unit tactics could be applied defensively as well as offensively, but it also showed that once committed to holding key terrain, they functioned much like any other infantry battalion and were exposed to sustained attritional combat. Supply and medical support during this period highlighted the logistical constraints on both sides. American forces on Guadalcanal relied on a tenuous stream of transports guarded by limited naval forces. Japanese night attacks by surface ships and air raids sometimes disrupted this flow, causing shortages in ammunition and rations that affected all units, including the raiders. Japanese troops advancing through the interior faced even more severe difficulties, with long marches through jungle, limited pack animals, and supply lines exposed to air attack and raids. Many Japanese soldiers reached the battlefield with reduced food and ammunition, which influenced the intensity and duration of their assaults. Politically, the stakes attached to Guadalcanal increased as casualties mounted. In Washington, the ability of Marine and later Army forces to retain the airfield, despite repeated attacks, was seen as a test of American capacity to conduct offensive operations in the Pacific, while resources were heavily committed to the Atlantic and North African theaters. In Tokyo, failure to recapture the island threatened the integrity of the southeastern perimeter and exposed Japanese shipping routes to air attacks from Henderson Field. Within this wider context, the role of the raider battalions on the ridges and in reconnaissance patrols formed only one part of a much larger struggle, but contributed to the overall defensive system. For the local population of Guadalcanal, the escalated conflict brought displacement and hardship. Many inhabitants had already left plantation areas when fighting began, but continued operations, artillery fire, and airstrikes further disrupted livelihoods. The presence of raider patrols, Japanese columns, and later Army units meant that villages, gardens, and coastal settlements became potential routes or targets for both sides. The contrast between the originally envisioned short raids and the reality of drawn-out island battles marked a turning point in how specialized Marine units would be used for the remainder of the campaign. By mid-1943, the Marine Raider battalions had been consolidated into the 1st Marine Raider Regiment under Colonel Harry B. Liversedge, with the 1st, 3rd, and 4th Raider battalions forming its core. Their strength combined totaled roughly 2,500 to 3,000 officers and men. The South Pacific Command planned to use this regiment as part of the New Georgia campaign, whose objective was to capture Japanese airfields at Munda and nearby positions that supported operations from the major base at Rabaul. For the Raiders, this marked the peak of their employment as a concentrated formation, rather than as small detachments. Operation Toenails, the code name for the New Georgia operations, involved more than 30,000 Allied troops, including Army and Marine units, engineers, and support personnel. Japanese forces under the Southeast Area Command maintained approximately 10,000 to 12,000 troops in the Central Solomons, with garrisons spread across Kolombangara, New Georgia, and outlying islands. The Raiders' role was to secure key coastal points and inland routes that would enable larger forces to advance on Munda from the east, avoiding a direct frontal assault through heavily defended coastal positions. Landings at Segi Point, Vairu Harbor, and Wickham Anchorage in late June 1943 illustrated the combination of special and conventional tasks now assigned to the Raiders. At Segi, elements of the 4th Raider Battalion went ashore to protect the small airstrip used by reconnaissance aircraft and to secure the local Coastwatcher station. At Viru, Raider companies advanced inland along narrow jungle trails to outflank Japanese positions guarding the harbor. Resistance at these points was modest, with Japanese garrisons numbering in the dozens rather than hundreds. But the terrain, swamps, dense vegetation, and steep ridges turned movement into a protracted effort that depended on guides, native carriers, and small boat transport. As the campaign progressed, the focus shifted to the advance on Munda from the Kula Gulf side of New Georgia. The 1st Raider Regiment, operating alongside Army regiments such as the 169th and 172nd Infantry, moved through interior jungle to cut tracks, secure high ground, and probe Japanese defenses. In July 1943, Raider battalions participated in the attempt to capture Bairoko Harbor, a key Japanese supply point on the northwestern coast. Intelligence suggested that the harbor was held by a garrison of several hundred troops. In reality, the defenders included reinforced elements of the 13th Infantry Regiment and naval personnel, supported by mortars, machine guns, and well-prepared positions. On July 20th, approximately 2,500 Marines from the Raider Regiment and the 4th Marines advanced toward Bairoko along narrow approaches under intermittent Japanese artillery and mortar fire. Attacks against ridgeline bunkers and concealed positions led to repeated close-range engagements. The Raiders' lighter weapons and limited organic artillery support, suitable for earlier small-scale raids, were less effective against deeply dug-in defenses supported by weapons brought in over months. After a day of fighting that produced several hundred casualties on the American side and significant losses among the Japanese defenders, higher command ordered a withdrawal to avoid further attrition, without clear prospect of immediate success. The New Georgia operations imposed high demands on medical and logistical systems. Evacuation of wounded raiders and infantrymen required stretcher parties and small craft along coastal routes. Tropical diseases such as malaria and dysentery reduced effective strength in both American and Japanese units. For local inhabitants whose villages and gardens lay along the lines of advance, the campaign meant compulsory labor as carriers, disruption of subsistence agriculture, and periodic shelling or bombing, as both sides targeted suspected enemy positions near populated areas. Some residents cooperated closely with Allied coast watchers, while others encountered Japanese patrols or found themselves in contested zones where control shifted repeatedly. At the command level, the intense fighting on New Georgia prompted reassessment of how best to employ specialized battalions. Reports from the Bairoko action noted that Raider units, once committed to frontal assaults against fortified positions, faced the same requirements for heavy support and sustained logistics as standard infantry. The advantages gained from rigorous small unit training and high physical standards could not fully offset the absence of organic artillery and tanks when confronting entrenched defenders. Japanese commanders, analyzing the campaign from the perspective of Rabaul and local headquarters, recognized that relatively small Allied units could now operate effectively deep in jungle terrain, forcing them to allocate troops to inland as well as coastal defenses. By the time Munda Airfield fell in early August 1943, the 1st Marine Raider Regiment had been engaged continuously for several weeks, with cumulative casualties in killed, wounded, and sick reducing some battalions to a fraction of their initial strength. The concentration of all available Raider battalions in a single campaign, their integration with larger Army formations, and their use in conventional assaults as well as reconnaissance marked this phase as the operational high point of the Raider concept in terms of scale and intensity. The experience of Guadalcanal and New Georgia led American commanders to reassess how Marine Raider units should operate. Reports from the South Pacific Force and Marine Corps headquarters noted that battalions designed for short raids had in practice been employed for weeks or months in jungle campaigns, with cumulative casualties and sickness reducing strength by 30 to 50% in some companies. Officers who had advocated the Raider concept acknowledged that, without organic artillery, armor, and large supply echelons, these units were most effective when used for reconnaissance, flank security, and limited objective attacks rather than sustained frontal assaults against fortified positions. Adaptation began at the level of organization and training. Fire teams of 4 men, already tested in Carlson's battalion, were increasingly formalized as the basic maneuver element, each combining automatic weapons, riflemen, and grenadiers. Instruction at bases in New Caledonia and Espiritu Santo shifted toward long-range patrolling, navigation by compass and terrain features, and coordination with air and naval gunfire. Medical personnel emphasized malaria control, water purification, and field hygiene, responding to figures that showed non-battle disease cases among raiders and regular infantry numbering in the thousands across the Solomons campaigns. One of the clearest examples of raider adaptation to local conditions had occurred earlier on Guadalcanal in the so-called Long Patrol. In November and December 1942, approximately 220 men of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion conducted a 29-day movement through the interior, covering more than 150 kilometers to disrupt Japanese units approaching from the west. Operating in small columns, the raiders relied on native guides, Coast Watcher information, and intermittent aerial resupply. Engagements with scattered Japanese detachments resulted in several dozen Japanese killed and the destruction of supplies, while raider losses included around 18 killed and a larger number evacuated for wounds or illness. The patrol demonstrated that lightly equipped troops could remain in the field for extended periods, but also showed the physical strain imposed by constant movement in tropical terrain. Japanese forces adjusted in response to such operations. Patrols from the 17th Army on Guadalcanal, and later from garrisons in New Georgia and Bougainville, increased their own reconnaissance activities, laying ambushes along likely approach routes and strengthening security around supply dumps. Reports from Japanese officers described the need to counter enemy units that appeared suddenly in rear areas and then withdrew before larger forces could concentrate. This required committing additional personnel to outpost duty and patrols at a time when overall Japanese strength in many island garrisons was static or declining due to shipping losses and limited reinforcement. The Bougainville campaign in late 1943 provided another setting for raider adaptation. When Allied forces landed at Empress Augusta Bay on the 1st of November, elements of the 2nd and 3rd Raider battalions went ashore alongside regular Marine regiments. Their tasks included seizing initial beachheads, pushing inland to secure a perimeter for the construction of airfields, and conducting patrols into the surrounding jungle. Japanese defenders, drawn from the 17th Army with an estimated strength of more than 30,000 on the island, initially held positions farther inland, but soon began probing attacks toward the Allied lodgment. In the ensuing weeks, raider companies operated along river lines and ridge systems, locating Japanese infiltration attempts and directing artillery fire. When a major Japanese counteroffensive developed in March 1944 against the Toracana perimeter, raider units formed part of the defensive network alongside Army divisions, such as the 37th and Americal. In this context, their role was not that of independent raiding formations, but of reinforced infantry battalions integrated into a larger system of strongpoints, machine gun nests, and artillery positions. Japanese units attacking the perimeter encountered coordinated fire from multiple directions, rather than isolated small groups. At the tactical level, both sides continued to modify equipment and methods. American raiders and infantry increased their use of portable radios to call for supporting fire, while mortar and machine gun sections were reinforced in recognition of the need for sustained firepower, even in small unit actions. Japanese troops adapted camouflage, movement by night, and dispersal to reduce losses from Allied artillery and air attacks. Local inhabitants, including Solomon Islanders and Bougainville communities, adapted to the presence of expanded Allied bases by serving as laborers, guides, and transport workers, but they also faced the risk of retaliation from Japanese patrols if suspected of cooperation. The psychological dimension of this prolonged fighting was evident in unit reports and personal accounts. Marine raiders, originally volunteers for hazardous but short operations, now experienced repeated campaigns with limited rest, leading some to request transfer to other units or to rear area duties after wounds or illness. Japanese soldiers on isolated islands faced shortages of food, medicine, and information about the wider war, contributing to fatigue and reduced operational effectiveness. For civilians living near contested areas, continual movement of patrols, occasional shelling, and requisition of food and labor required constant adjustment to shifting control and the demands of two different military forces. By early 1944, the strategic pattern of the Pacific War had shifted toward large-scale amphibious assaults across the Central Pacific, with operations at Tarawa, Kwajalein, and preparations for Saipan and Guam. These landings involved entire divisions, supported by extensive naval gunfire, carrier aviation, and heavy artillery. Within this framework, senior Marine Corps and Navy planners reviewed whether separate raider battalions still met a distinct operational need. Reports from Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and Bougainville showed that raider units had usually been employed as conventional infantry in protracted campaigns rather than in brief, independent raids. At Marine Corps headquarters, Commandant Thomas Holcomb and senior staff examined the structure of the Fleet Marine Force. Their analysis emphasized that ordinary Marine infantry regiments had adopted many of the techniques first associated with raiders: fire team organization, night patrolling, and amphibious training. The existence of separate raider formations, recruiting volunteers, and experienced non-commissioned officers was increasingly seen as duplicating capabilities that were now being standardized across the Corps. The argument that all Marines are elite expressed an institutional preference for uniform training and organization, rather than maintaining small, distinct units. Operational demands reinforced this view. The upcoming campaigns in the Marianas and later the Ryukyus required fully equipped infantry regiments with organic artillery, heavy weapons, and support elements. Raider battalions, configured with lighter tables of equipment and fewer heavy weapons, would have to be reorganized to fit into divisional structures. Commanders in the Pacific recommended that experienced raider personnel be integrated into regular regiments where their combat experience could strengthen larger formations, instead of remaining in separate, smaller units whose missions had become less clearly differentiated. Comparisons with other special formations influenced the debate. The U.S. Army's Ranger battalions had suffered heavy losses in North Africa and Italy, particularly at Cisterna in early 1944, leading to questions about employing small, high-quality units in frontal assaults against strong defenses. British commandos, while retained for certain raids and assaults, also operated increasingly in brigade-sized groupings alongside conventional forces. These examples suggested that once specialized troops were committed to major operations, pressures often pushed them toward roles similar to regular infantry, eroding the distinctiveness that had justified their separate status. Within the raider units, reactions to the prospect of reorganization were mixed. Some officers and enlisted men valued the identity and traditions that had developed since 1942, including battalion insignia and a sense of volunteer status. Others, after extended service in the Solomons and on Bougainville, saw advantages in joining larger regiments with more robust support, clearer replacement systems, and better prospects for rest and rotation. Medical and personnel records indicated that many raiders had already been transferred due to wounds, illness, or expiration of enlistments, reducing the proportion of original volunteers in the battalions. Japanese assessments of American capabilities also evolved during this period. Reports from island commands and from Imperial General Headquarters noted that U.S. operations now typically involved overwhelming naval and air support, rapid construction of airfields, and methodical expansion of beachheads. The threat of small-scale coastal raids by Marine raiders or Army Rangers remained, but it was overshadowed by the repeated pattern of division-sized landings that brought substantial artillery and logistics ashore. Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, which had once been used for their own limited amphibious operations, were by 1944 often tied down in static defense roles or had been absorbed into mixed garrisons, mirroring in some respects the American move away from separate elite assault formations. The formal turning point for the Marine Raiders came with administrative orders in early 1944 that directed the disbanding of the Raider Regiment as a distinct entity. The 1st, 3rd, and 4th Raider Battalions were redesignated as battalions of the 4th Marines, a regiment assigned to the newly formed 6th Marine Division. Personnel from Raider organizations thus entered a division that would fight as part of the main assault forces in later campaigns. The 2nd Raider Battalion had already been reorganized earlier. On paper, the term Raider disappeared from official Marine Corps unit titles, even as many of the individuals and tactical practices continued in new structures. For the American public, this change was not immediately visible. Newsreels, magazine articles, and books had already presented Marine raiders as a distinctive formation, and those images persisted even after the administrative reorganization. At the operational and institutional level, however, the decision marked a clear break. What had begun in 1942 as an experiment in small, specially trained amphibious forces ended in 1944 with their absorption into standard infantry regiments, reflecting a shift from improvisation and experimentation toward a more uniform doctrine for large-scale amphibious warfare in the Pacific. The redesignation of the Raider battalions into the 4th Marines did not end their combat role. As part of the 6th Marine Division, these former Raider companies took part in 2 of the last major amphibious operations of the Pacific War. In July 1944, during the recapture of Guam, battalions containing many former Raiders landed on beaches at Asan and Agat alongside other Marine and Army units. Japanese forces on Guam, estimated at more than 18,000 troops from the 29th Division and naval units, resisted from prepared positions in the interior. Over roughly 3 weeks of fighting, American casualties on Guam totaled around 7,000 killed and wounded, while Japanese fatalities exceeded 17,000, with only several hundred prisoners taken. Local Chamorro civilians, numbering about 20,000 before the campaign, emerged from years of occupation, with significant losses in housing, food supplies, and public infrastructure. In April 1945, the 6th Marine Division, including the 4th Marines, landed on Okinawa as part of an assault force of approximately 180,000 U.S. troops. Japanese defenders, drawn from the 32nd Army, with around 77,000 soldiers plus naval personnel and labor units, adopted a defense in depth around the southern part of the island. Former Raider battalions fought as standard infantry in operations around the Motobu Peninsula and later in the advance southward. Okinawan civilians, whose pre-war population approached 450,000, faced artillery bombardment, air attacks, forced labor, and displacement into caves and makeshift shelters. By the end of the campaign in June 1945, U.S. forces had suffered more than 12,000 killed and over 36,000 wounded. Japanese military deaths exceeded 60,000, and civilian deaths on Okinawa are generally estimated in the tens of thousands. For the individuals who had served in Raider units, the immediate aftermath of the war meant demobilization, reassignment, or continued service in a peacetime Marine Corps. Many former Raiders were among the first to be eligible for discharge due to their length of overseas service and accumulated campaign credits. Others remained in uniform as non-commissioned officers and officers in the post-war 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions, bringing with them experience from early raiding operations and later large-scale amphibious battles. Personnel records for these veterans show a mixture of early enlistment separations, re-enlistments, and transfers into reserve components. On the Japanese side, the end of fighting in the islands where Raiders had operated produced varied outcomes for surviving garrisons. Some units, such as remnants on New Georgia and Bougainville, were evacuated or redeployed before final Allied advances, while others, including isolated contingents in the Solomons and Gilberts, remained cut off until surrender orders arrived in August and September 1945. Officers and soldiers from these garrisons became prisoners of war held in camps in New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, and Japan. Their interrogations contributed to Allied historical analyses of how island defenses had been planned and how they responded to small unit raids and later divisional assaults. Legal and judicial consequences followed specific incidents connected with Raider operations. After the war, Allied tribunals examined cases in which prisoners taken during small raids had been executed contrary to the laws and customs of war. One of the best documented involved members of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, captured after the Makin raid in 1942, and subsequently executed by Japanese naval authorities. Post-war trials assessed responsibility among officers who had ordered or approved these executions. Sentences range from imprisonment to capital punishment, reflecting the application of international legal standards that had been only partially observed during the conflict. For civilian populations on islands touched by Raider actions, the immediate post-war period brought a combination of relief and disruption. On the Gilbert Islands, Solomon Islands, and New Georgia Group, Allied military governments and returning colonial administrations sought to clear unexploded ordnance, rebuild airstrips and ports for commercial use, and restore local agriculture. Villagers who had provided guides, labor, or information to Allied raider patrols during the war sometimes received recognition or modest financial compensation, while others dealt with the loss of land to airfields and bases that remained in use for several years. Japanese civilian settlers and contract workers who had lived on some islands were repatriated, often under difficult conditions due to shortages of shipping and supplies in the immediate post-war years. Within the United States, former raiders returned to a society undergoing rapid demobilization and economic conversion. Some used benefits under the Servicemen's Readjustment Act to pursue education or vocational training, while others re-entered pre-war occupations or took jobs in expanding industrial sectors. Veterans organizations, including the Marine Corps League and smaller raider associations, began to form networks for mutual support and to commemorate unit history. Medical follow-up documented long-term effects of malaria, tropical ulcers, and combat-related injuries among these veterans, issues shared with other Pacific Campaign participants. In Japan, the outcomes of the Pacific Island campaigns, including those in which raider and successor units had participated, fed into broader debates about the conduct of the war. Former officers and soldiers wrote memoirs and reports that described the challenges of supplying remote garrisons, the impact of Allied naval and air superiority, and encounters with small, mobile enemy units operating in terrain they had considered difficult or inaccessible. For many, the loss of islands such as Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and Guam represented stages in a gradual contraction that culminated in the bombing of the home islands and surrender in August 1945. By the late 1940s, the immediate military consequences of raider operations had largely merged into the wider pattern of the Pacific campaigns. The units themselves no longer existed under their original titles, and the islands where they had fought were incorporated into new political arrangements, including United Nations trust territories and decolonization processes. What remained in the short term were the individual experiences of veterans, the altered lives of civilians on former battlegrounds, and the records, operational reports, trial transcripts, and administrative orders that documented the transition from wartime raiding experiments to post-war military and civilian reconstruction. In the decades after 1945, the Marine Raiders occupied an ambiguous place in the history of special purpose forces. On one side, official Marine Corps doctrine highlighted continuity. Post-war manuals and training materials emphasized that all Marine infantry were expected to conduct night attacks, reconnaissance patrols, and amphibious landings, functions that had once been associated with raider units. The fire team structure, the emphasis on combined arms at battalion level, and the integration of amphibious training into divisional routines reflected lessons learned across the Pacific, not only within the raider battalions, but also in standard regiments that had fought on Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. At the same time, the raider experience contributed to later developments in U.S. special operations. In the 1950s and 1960s, when the Marine Corps created force reconnaissance companies for deep reconnaissance and direct action tasks, planners drew on archives, field reports, and veterans' experience from earlier long-range patrols and limited landings. The U.S. Navy's underwater demolition teams and later SEAL units evolved in parallel, focusing on hydrographic reconnaissance and clandestine raids rather than battalion-scale operations. The concept that relatively few personnel could have disproportionate operational effects in coastal and archipelagic environments thus reappeared in modified form during the Cold War. Historians and officers debated whether the raider experiment had been necessary or whether similar results could have been achieved by regular infantry units with additional training. Some studies argued that, given the relatively modest scale of independent raider operations, Tulagi, Makin, Tasimboko, and extended patrols, the primary outcomes were doctrinal and organizational, proving that light, mobile forces could operate from submarines and fast transports and encouraging wider adoption of flexible small unit tactics. Others emphasized the opportunity cost, noting that Concentrating experienced personnel in specialized battalions temporarily reduced the average experience level in other regiments at a time when the Corps was expanding rapidly. From the Japanese perspective, post-war analyses placed raider actions within a sequence of pressures that eroded island garrisons, submarine attacks on shipping, carrier airstrikes, and finally large amphibious assaults. Staff studies produced for the War History series in Japan treated American raids as indicators of increasing Allied reach rather than as decisive events in themselves. They noted that the need to guard against sudden landings by limited numbers of troops forced Japanese commanders to disperse forces, construct additional outposts, and allocate ammunition and food to positions that might never be attacked, thereby complicating an already strained logistical situation. For island societies in the Solomons, Gilberts, and Marianas, the legacy of raider operations formed part of a broader wartime memory shaped by displacement, labor service, and the presence of foreign military forces. Local accounts remembered episodes such as the Long Patrol or the seizure of coastal points, alongside larger events like the Guadalcanal campaign or the Battle for Guam. In some communities, assistance given to raider patrols became part of village history and was later referenced during debates over land rights, compensation for wartime damage, or recognition of wartime service. Monuments and plaques erected after the war often commemorated both Allied forces and local coast watchers or guides. Within the United States, commemoration of the raiders developed unevenly. Immediately after the war, attention focused on the larger campaigns and on the atomic bombings that ended the conflict. Over time, unit associations, memoirs, and oral histories brought renewed attention to early raids and patrols. Regimental and battalion reunions collected documents and photographs, some of which were later deposited in archives and museums. The reactivation in the early 21st century of a Marine Special Operations Regiment using the Raider name reflected an institutional decision to connect contemporary units to a historical lineage, even though equipment, doctrine, and geopolitical context differed significantly from those of 1942 to 1944. The Raiders also entered broader discussions about special forces in democratic societies. Military analysts and political scientists examining the expansion of special operations commands after the Vietnam War and during the post-Cold War period used historical cases, including the Marine Raiders, U.S. Rangers, British Commandos, and German and Japanese special purpose units, to explore questions of oversight, mission definition, and integration with conventional forces. The Raider experience demonstrated that specialized units could be created rapidly in response to operational needs, but that their long-term existence depended on whether their functions remained distinct once larger forces adapted. In historiography, interpretations of the Raiders shifted as new sources became available. Early narratives relied heavily on unit records and veteran accounts, often emphasizing endurance and tactical innovation. Later, scholarship placed these units within a wider framework that included Japanese operational records, civilian testimonies, and comparative studies of amphibious warfare. This research highlighted not only successes but also limitations. The difficulties at Makin, the heavy casualties at Edson Ridge and Barroco, and the eventual absorption of Raider battalions into standard regiments when campaign requirements changed. For the Marine Corps, the lasting significance of the Raiders lay less in their brief existence as separate battalions and more in the influence they exerted on doctrine, training, and institutional identity. The idea that infantry units should be capable of rapid movement from sea to shore, operate in dispersed fire teams, and coordinate closely with naval and air support became part of general practice. The later creation of specialized reconnaissance and special operations units built on this foundation, adapting it to new technologies and missions. Viewed from multiple perspectives, American, Japanese, and local civilian, the Marine Raiders were one component of a much larger conflict that reshaped the Pacific. Their operations intersected with strategic decisions about where to commit divisions, how to use sea power, and how to manage limited resources across vast distances. Their short institutional life, from formal establishment in 1942 to redesignation by 1944, illustrates how military organizations experiment with new forms in wartime, adopt some innovations into general practice, and set aside others when conditions and priorities change.